How does a war start? Is it a spark, a bomb, a flag raised on a foreign shore? Or is it something quieter, like a whisper in a church pew, a newspaper headline read over breakfast? In 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. On the surface, it was a war of liberation, a fight for Cuban freedom. But beneath that noble cause was a tangled web of ambition, manipulation, and yes, sensational headlines. And the church, it didn't just sit on the sidelines. It helped light the fire. Welcome back. This is the Church History Podcast. I'm Lorelee Siemens, and in this season, Church at War, we've been exploring the strange intersection where faith meets conflict. Today, we're stepping into the frenzy of the Spanish-American War, not through the eyes of soldiers, but through the eyes of reporters, preachers, and a girl locked in a Cuban prison whose face would ignite an empire. It's New York City, 1897. The city roared with the sounds of clattering hooves, shouting newsboys, and the relentless pounding of printing presses. Nearly 50 newspapers competed for attention across the boroughs. But two names towered above the rest. The New York World, led by veteran Joseph Pulitzer, and the New York Journal, owned by a young and ambitious William Randolph Hearst. Their battle wasn't just for readers, it was for dominance. Every headline, every scoop, every extra edition was a bullet in a daily war of ink and ambition. Pulitzer had made his name exposing corruption and championing people with low incomes. But Hearst, he was flush with inherited wealth and he had hungry for glory. He was rewriting the rules with bigger headlines, bolder illustrations, and stories that blurred the line between truth and theater. And now the biggest story of all was brewing just 90 miles from Florida. Cuba was on fire. For years, Cuban revolutionaries had fought to shake off Spanish rule. Spain, refusing to let go of one of the most imperial holdings, responded with overwhelming force. It burned villages. It imprisoned dissenters. It herded civilians into brutal reconcentration camps. Tensions were near a breaking point. The U.S. watched uneasily. War was possible, maybe even inevitable. But Hearst wasn't content to wait. He wanted war on the front page, and he was willing to help make it happen. So he sent his star artist, Frederick Remington, and a famed reporter named Richard Harding Davis to Havana aboard his private yacht, the Vamoose. They had their orders. Sniff out blood, revolution, anything that could spark America's concern. But for weeks, nothing surfaced. Then came a cable from Remington. Everything quiet. Stop. No trouble here. Stop. Will be no war. Stop. Wish to return. Most editors would have folded. Hearst didn't. He replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures. I'll furnish the war." It was bold, arrogant, and prophetic. Because Hearst wasn't just reporting history, he was about to create it. And Pulitzer, watching from across Park Row, knew he'd have to match the journal's fire or risk becoming yesterday's news. Two titans of the press, one fragile island in rebellion. The match had been struck. Now the world waited for the flame. The air inside Casa de Recogidas. It was a grim women's prison in Havana. It was heavy with rot and heat. Disease swirls through the cells like smoke. There's a stench of unwashed bodies mingled with the slow death of the women inside. Yellow fever and the terrifying vomito negro had claimed the lives here. It liquefied organs, and it leaves victims screaming, and very few survive. Here, a young girl sits alone on a rough wooden bench. Her hands are bound, her face pale but determined. She carries a quiet dignity of someone who will not break no matter what. Her name is Evangelina Cocio Cisneros. She is just 17 years old, a child, but her name is known from Havana to Madrid, and soon in every living room in America. She is the daughter of a prominent Cuban family and a niece to a well-known revolutionary leader. Her father, Agustin Cocio, was once the governor of the Isle of Penice. But when Spain began cracking down on Cuban rebellion, her family's political ties became dangerous. Evangelina had supported her father and uncle in the cause for Cuban independence. Not by carrying a rifle, she carried messages. She was educated, articulate, and fiercely loyal to her country. She believed in the dream of a free Cuba, and she wasn't afraid to express her views. That was enough. Spanish soldiers arrested her on trumped-up charges of attempted assassination and prostitution. In reality, the arrest was a political move. They needed to break the morale of the revolutionaries, and targeting the young, beautiful Evangelina sent a clear message. No one was safe. But they underestimated her. A reporter from the New York Journal had followed a whisper lead led to the gates of the prison. After bribing and sweet-talking his way inside, he was allowed 5 minutes with the prisoner. That was all he needed. She was young, beautiful, imprisoned, and critically, she was innocent. The perfect symbol. When the report reached William Randolph Hearst back in New York, he reportedly leapt from his chair. "We've got Spain now," he declared. And from that moment, Evangelina was no longer just a girl in prison. She was a cause. The Journal launched a campaign that blurred the lines between journalism and theater. They called her the Cuban Joan of Arc. They printed sketches of her face. They published her diary. They described her as a brave virgin unjustly persecuted by a Spanish commander. Headlines screamed about her victimhood, her beauty, her bravery. Thousands of women in America, Christian homemakers, teachers, society ladies, signed petitions for her release. Clara Barton of the Red Cross lent her name. So did Mrs. Jefferson Davis, who was widow of a former Confederate president. Together, they formed an unlikely coalition of compassion. But Hearst didn't just stop at letters. In a cloak and dagger operation, the Journal reporter traveled back to Havana and bribed her guards. Late one night, they smuggled her out of prison in disguise, across the city and onto a ship bound for New York. When she arrived, the spectacle was immediate. Hearst had her dressed in a custom white gown. He hosted a grand reception in Madison Square Park. Thousands of New Yorkers gathered to see her. Women wept, men cheered, bands played. Evangelina, radiant but reserved, stood on the raised platform like royalty. She was hailed not just as a survivor, she was a heroine. And then came the dinner at Delmoncio's, the famed Manhattan restaurant where presidents dined. She ate steak, sipped champagne, while reporters scribbled every detail. She had barely escaped with her life. Now she was the face of a nation's crusade. And in the pulpits across the country, pastors told her story to the congregations. Evangelina became a parable used to illustrate the horrors of Spanish tyranny, the beauty of American compassion, and the righteousness of intervention. One girl, one headline, and now a country teetering on the edge of war. This wasn't just media circuit. In churches across America, pulpits echoed these headlines. Evangelical pastors called for a messianic intervention. It wasn't just political, they said, it was righteous. America had a divine mission. Cuba wasn't just a colony in rebellion, it was a soul crying out for salvation. And Evangelina, she wasn't just a political prisoner, she was a martyr, another Esther, another Ruth. Churches had held prayer vigils for her. Pastors quoted the journals in sermons. They challenged young men to become Christian soldiers, literally. If Christ were to walk the streets of Havana today, he would not carry a sermon, he would carry a sword. The press wrote the story, the church gave it moral authority. Even Joseph Pulitzer, who had once sworn never to glamorize war, couldn't resist. In his younger years, he had fought the Civil War. He knew the cost of conflict. But by 1898, he was losing readers to Hearst. His empire was shrinking, and so he joined the chorus. He framed the war as necessary, but rational. God forbid we advocate unnecessary war, he wrote, but this is no ordinary conflict. It is duty. It is freedom. Soon, even the most cautious headlines turned to cries of battle. The Spanish-American War didn't begin with troops landing in Cuba. It began with a line of type and a nation stirred by sacred outrage. Then came February 15th, 1898. Havana Harbor lies quiet under the moonlight. The waters are calm, the night wind still. Moored in the bay is US Maine, a 6,600-ton armored cruiser sent by the United States not to provoke, but to project. It's there to show strength. It's a diplomatic flex of muscle. Officially, it's a friendly visit, a symbol of U.S. concern for the chaos unfolding in Spanish-ruled Cuba. But in the early hours of the morning, the harbor is torn open by fire and steel. A sudden, deafening explosion rips through the forward hull of the Maine, shattering the calm and engulfing the ship in flames. Sailors scream in confusion as the deck buckles. Some are incinerated instantly. Others are hurled into the sea. Within minutes, the Maine is a smoldering, sinking carcass. Out of 355 crew members, 260 are dead. The nation reels. In Washington, President William McKinley pleads for patience. He orders a formal investigation. Behind closed doors, experts begin combing over naval blueprints, survivor accounts, and debris recovered from the harbor floor. The question is agonizingly simple. What caused the explosion? But the answer remains elusive. Some point to a coral bunker fire, an accidental ignition of coal dust near a powder magazine, a tragically common hazard on 19th century ships. Others claimed that a submerged Spanish mine or a deliberate act of sabotage is responsible. The U.S. Navy Court of Inquiry, conducted under enormous public pressure, eventually issued a vague conclusion. An external mine is believed to be responsible, but that's all the press needs. The nuance is lost as ink hits paper. Hearst's New York Journal runs massive front-page headlines. The warship Maine split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine. And below it, the rally cry that would echo across the country. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. In pulpits, from Boston to San Francisco, pastors repeated the phrase with thunder. What began as journalism now becomes liturgy. Churches organize patriotic prayer meetings. Ministers preach sermons, equating the victims of Maine with Christian martyrs. Congregations are told that America was not just politically right. They had a divine responsibility to respond with force. The death of the sailors are described as sacred sacrifice. A holy injustice demands holy retribution. No one asks for proof. They already have their altar. The facts are irrelevant now. The Maine has become a symbol. And symbols, especially in times of tension, make dangerous fuel. So, while McKinley stalls for answer, the public has already formed their opinions. It's not a political crisis, it's a moral crusade. And war is no longer a question if, but when. From Methodists in Missouri to Baptists in Boston, preachers were on fire. They spoke of America being chosen by God, sent to bring light to the nations. They quoted Psalms, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hands of the wicked. They called Spain a godless empire, a modern-day pharaoh. And they held up Evangelina like Deborah or Mary Magdalene, proof that God was calling America to action. They urged young men to enlist, not for land, not for glory, but for God. Even the Salvation Army, which usually stayed out of politics, began printing material that was supportive of the war. To oppose the war was to oppose righteousness. April 20th, 1898. Congress declares war. Within days, American troops land on Cuban soil. Soon after, they march through Puerto Rico and steam towards the Philippines. What had taken Spain centuries to build crumbles in really just a few weeks. By August, the war is over. Spain surrenders. The Treaty of Paris is signed. America gains Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, its first overseas empire. In churches across the United States, the mood is one of triumph. God has blessed our arms. His justice matches with the stars and stripes. Pastors preach that America has extended the reach of Christian liberty. The hand of God is guiding this new expansion. It is to say, a holy victory. But not everyone joins the celebration. In the Philippines, American missionaries who had been stationed there long before the war begin sending troubling letters home. What they see on the ground isn't matching the headlines in the Journal or the World. Where the newspapers had promised liberation, the missionaries report confusion and resistance. Where the sermons have declared justice, the missionaries are seeing cruelty. Some missionaries in the Philippines begin writing about American troops who are treating locals with disdain. They talk about villages being raided, civilians being roughed up, and little concern is shown for the culture or the dignity of the people. These aren't public statements. They're not printed in national papers. These are handwritten letters traveled quietly from missionaries to families, from pastors to church elders. And for those willing to listen, they had an unsettling question. What if the war hadn't been so righteous after all? Back in the United States, some pastors began to shift tone. A few brave voices, mostly in urban congregations, start to reflect out loud. Had the church been played? Had churches become megaphones for men like Hearst and Pulitzer? Had pastors, caught up in the whirlwind of patriotism and sensational journalism, mistaken propaganda for providence? It was too late to stop the war. The empire had already expanded, but the disillusionment was growing. And for a small but growing number of Christians, the events of 1898 would become a cautionary tale. Be careful whose war you bless, because not every battle dressed in righteousness is actually fought in the name of Christ. In the years that follow, a term emerges, yellow journalism. It's not named for gold or sunshine, but for sensational, the salacious, the scandalous. Journalism that ignores truth for the sake of spectacle. It's named after a yellow cartoon that had published in the newspapers. Even all the way back in the late 1800s, people began to realize journalism could not be trusted. And the church, the moral compass of society, had helped sell a story. Clergy were not coerced. They were inspired and perhaps misled. Because it's easy to preach about justice. It's much harder to ask whose justice, whose truth. And amid all of the shouting, there were stories of real Cubans, ordinary believers who were caught in the crossfire. Those stories were lost beneath the headlines. The legacy of the Spanish-American War is anything but simple. For some, it marked the rise of the United States as a global power, a turning point that led to military reform and a newfound influence on the world stage. Cuba gained formal independence from Spain, marking the end of centuries of Spanish rule across the Americas and the Pacific. But beneath the victories, there were shadows, especially in places like the Philippines. American occupation sparked a brutal and bloody conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. In Cuba, the so-called freedom came with strings attached, as U.S. interference through the Plight Amendment left many feeling their sovereignty had simply shifted hands. While Spain experienced a cultural and economical renewal after the war, it came after the bitter loss of its empire. And the cause of the war, the explosion of the USS Maine, remains clouded in uncertainty, its narrative shaped more by yellow journalism than by proven fact. To this day, no one knows why the USS Maine exploded. Was the war good? Was it just? I guess it depends on where you stand. But history reminds us The cost of war, especially war born out of sensationalism and empire, is always more complicated than the headlines suggest. So what do we take from all this? Well, a war lasted 10 weeks, but it was a movement that changed America's role in the world. A girl in a cell, a ship in a harbor, a nation stirred by sermons and newsprint. A church, zealous, passionate, even sincere, helped sell a war. History doesn't always warn us with sirens. Sometimes it whispers through a pulpit, or it sings through a choir, or it prints a headline that makes us feel righteous before we've asked if we're right. Let's be humble. Let's be careful. Let us be people of truth, not easily swayed by the next Evangelina or the next explosion, because justice matters, but so does wisdom. Now, am I suggesting that the church should remain silent about culture or politics? Not at all. I believe the opposite. The church should be a trusted voice in times of chaos. That means church leaders must recognize the weight their words carry. People look to them for guidance, so their influence must be marked by wisdom and discernment, especially in what they believe, endorse, or repeat. This winter, I read a book called Shepherds for Sale, and I highly recommend it. In it, journalist Megan Basham of the Daily Wire explores how certain aspects of the church are being utilized to promote political and ideological agendas. It's timely and it's a challenging read, but it's one I believe every Christian should take seriously. For those of you who prefer listening, I actually went through the audiobook version, and as a bonus, if you have an Amazon Music account, you can listen to one audiobook per month for free, and Shepherds for Sale is one to add to your list. I'll put a link in the show notes. Next week, we're traveling to the heart of the Congo, November 2nd, 1904, where missionaries at a missionary station feared they would not live to see the sunrise. Among them is Althea Brown, a brilliant African-American missionary whose courage and faith were tested when rebel warriors, under orders to kill all missionaries and burn their homes, surrounds the compound. With only prayers on their lips and enemies at the gate, Athena and her fellow workers prepare to meet their fate. But God had other plans. Her story is one of incredible faith, resilience, and sacrifice, and it's one you don't want to miss. Join me as I tell the story of Althea Brown and also how the amazing story of the Song of the Doxology and how that saved lives. Until then, let's be peacemakers. Let's be seekers of truth. And let's never confuse propaganda with the gospel. I'm Lorelee Siemens, and this is the Church History Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at LoreleeSiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.